Welcome to the On the Blue Line podcast. I'm your host, Wayne Mulder, and this is our interview show, simply called The Interview Room. This week, I sit down with special guest Ben Killoy with military veteran dad. He's got a podcast and a great work that he's doing over there. This week does not disappoint. In fact, I encourage you, this will probably be one where I would suggest pulling out a pen and paper and maybe taking some notes. I guarantee you that if you listen to some of the advice and some of the wisdom that Ben gives you in this podcast and in this interview that I was able to do with him, it will absolutely make a difference in your life as it has in mine. So without any further time, I hope you enjoy this podcast as I sit down with Ben Killoy with the military veteran dad. The Interview Room starts now.
On my honor, I will never betray my badge, my integrity, my character, or the public trust. I will always have the courage to hold myself and others accountable for their actions. I will always uphold the Constitution, the community, and the agency
I serve. Well, Ben, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Wayne, for having me on. I'm really excited to dive into the blue here.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on. I know it took us a little while to make this happen, but I think the listeners are going to really enjoy this episode and what you have to share. Could we start? Maybe just introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about what you do and what you're all about.
So my name is Ben Killoy. I'm a husband, a father, and a Marine Corps veteran. I have 3 kids, 7, 5, and 3. I live in Milton, Wisconsin, which for geography lesson is just about 45 minutes south of Madison, Wisconsin. I served in the Marine Corps from 2003 to 2007, transitioned out with this simple idea that I was meant for bigger things, but I didn't know what that was, but I knew the Marine Corps was going to hold that back. And spent 10 years getting lost in the civilian world and really started diving into self-help maybe about 4 years ago. Downloaded a bunch of knowledge, but really didn't take a lot of action with it. So then I kind of got analysis paralysis. But then about a year ago, I had this idea for a veteran dad life coach or a veteran dad podcast. I'd listened to podcasts. It was kind of itching at my heart. And I was talking to some milspouses about this idea. And a few of them I brought to tears. And I realized that I was like, this is a raw emotion here. This is something I can work with. And this triggered me. I'm an emotional guy. I cry at happy endings all the time. And I was like, and then once I started looking at it, I realized there was no voice in that space. And so that was last September. And 3 months later, I launched on January 1st, the Military Veteran Dad podcast with a mission to bring every dad home.
And I've had the opportunity to listen to your show, and it's good stuff. I love what you're doing, and I love the space. Like you said, it's an area that really had a lot of need.
And it's good when you're the only one in there because your voice just starts echoing, and that actually gets louder on its own. There's no other people drowning it out.
Well, let me start with just some get to know you type questions that I ask every guest. Some of them are a little bit silly, but are you more of a coffee guy or a tea guy?
I drink tea when I'm sick, but I'm generally a coffee guy, and maybe a little rabbit hole on coffee. Maybe like 5 years ago, I've truly believed that the best part of waking up was Folgers in your cup. And it took a guy at work to really blow my mind that there's a world where Folgers is not the best part of waking up. And he purchased for us a AeroPress coffee press, which is just a plastic cylinder. You grind your beans per cup, and really got me hooked on this. And essentially it's like Americano, but you're hand making Americano each time. And now I've gone from the guy that drank Folgers as the gold standard to a guy that buys beans on the internet that are roasted a week old. And I handcraft every cup of coffee I make at work and at home. And so I've gone to a complete coffee snob.
There's nothing wrong with being an aficionado when it comes to coffee. I agree with you 100%.
But I've come a long way.
Yeah, you and me both. Well, mine started with staying with family on Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and cooking it over a campfire. So I've come a long way in the coffee world as well.
But I'm sure the coffee on the fire probably tastes a little bit better, even just naturally, just the way they were roasting it and the water, the temperature.
I would completely agree with you. Well, I kind of like different types of coffee. So I have everything from the Keurig to the pour over to I like all the above.
Keurig is like break glass in case of emergency. Starbucks is kind of like the floor for me. Don't really like Dunkin' too much. I like diner coffee. Something about diner coffee is always good. But almost everywhere I go, I always get an Americano that I can, because the trick about Americanos is they're always fresh when you get them, and you don't have to worry about the coffee and how old it was there. and pretty much every place can make you an Americano. So I'm ready to start the Americano revolution.
I love it. And that's a great needed thing.
Exactly. Brew coffee needs to die.
I couldn't agree with you more. Where's your favorite place to have that drink of coffee?
Well, that's an interesting question that you asked. So Starbucks is a floor for me, and probably the most common place that I'll have the coffee is Starbucks. So even before I had the idea for the podcast, last June of 2018, June of 2018, I realized that Starbucks opens at 5 a.m. on the weekends. So from June of last year till now, because I just did it 2 days in a row now, I've been at Starbucks at between 5 and 5:30 every day in the weekends working on something. Now it's my podcast, but even before I had the podcast, I was there blogging on Facebook, connecting, writing, and that's where I always have one. I have a tall Americano, and a secret about Starbucks, if you're reward members, you get free refills. So I usually get one Americano that's good coffee, and then before I go, I get a refill for the brew coffee, which is usually I get the dark because there's a different dark coffee every month. It gets the job done. And generally I'll have the coffee at home, but I generally don't get a lot of coffee when I go out, other than that coffee I have at Starbucks to start the day maybe, and one at home if I'm here doing work or just being home on the weekend.
I love that. I've started going to Starbucks as well because with the stars, you do get the free second cup. But also, I find Starbucks in our line of work to be a great place to watch human interaction. I love sitting in there early in the morning, watching the people come and go and watching them talk with each other. And it's kind of a study in humanity.
It is. And it's also interesting. I've been there. I spend on average 3 hours a day on the weekend at Starbucks in the morning. And I've done it for over a year. And there's people that see me over and over. Not a single one of them. I can't think of a single customer that has stopped and said, what is it that you do that you're sitting here every weekend on your own time at Starbucks? I've asked one other couple that is always, there's two women that were always there every morning, and they what do they do? They've been there like 5 a.m. They're just two random people that met at Starbucks, and they've been best friends for over like 10 years almost. They've been at Starbucks every morning on the weekends. I've made good friends with the baristas, and we've had lots of great conversations about things, but very few people actually interact with me, even though I'm sitting there every weekend. They're walking by.
I love that. What does that say though about how we are as people, how we are as Americans, because we definitely live siloed lives, that we can be in the same space as somebody else. And this has nothing to do with Starbucks or coffee, but I find it interesting for what both you and I do.
But what popped in my head is almost like there's a saran wrap layer around everyone that you can see through it, and it's like no one's there, and you still have random interactions, but you really only pull it away when you need to, and that's a lot of what's wrong with the world. But then it's also good because people are out there, they have their own little worlds, and you can take steps without having to worry about other people are thinking about you. But one of the biggest things that's moved my life forward, and I probably imagine for any police officer has the same problem, my ability to talk to strangers sucked 5 years ago. I had very few friends, and every person I talked to was that high school girl that was going to say no. And it took me talking to dads at the park to really work past that. And now, and this is maybe the mindset that's missing from society, is that I'm always one conversation away from something amazing coming in my life, and I'm going to miss 100% of those shots I don't take. So I'm always talking to random people in the lines and wherever I am, making conversation with the baristas at Starbucks, because I have no idea what's going to come from them. When I'm flying at airports, wherever I am, I'm always trying to strike up a conversation, because that one conversation could be the one person I've been waiting for all my life to come into it.
That's great. I love you pointing that out. And I know for myself, prior to law enforcement, we talked a little bit offline that I've only been in law enforcement 8 years, but prior to law enforcement, I sucked at it too. And one thing that law enforcement helps you with is communicating with people, both in a positive and negative circumstance.
Yeah, under distress and positive.
Yeah, so it's really good for coming out of your shell and getting used to those conversations. One thing I've seen, though, is you also kind of develop the opposite, where after a 12-hour shifts, the last thing you feel like doing is talking to people. So sometimes you are that guy sitting in the coffee shop, just you observe and you see what everyone else is doing, but you don't actually feel like talking to anybody.
Or I could also see the tool, because it's definitely a tool. But if you associate it with the uniform that you put on, you can often think that you leave it behind when you take the uniform off, and that you're not that person when the uniform's off. But I can honestly say the one thing, and this is transition advice I give for every veteran now, that the one skill that will change your life forever is your ability to talk to strangers at any given moment, because that's the only, every problem has been solved. You just need to find the person that solved it. And you can't do that unless you talk to people, and you can't have a network. You can't have people that are helping support you with a movement of a podcast or really anything unless you talk to people. And so many of what holds us back is, even as Americans, I've been thinking, like, imagine if people weren't afraid to talk to people at Starbucks. If you think of, like, I've been kind of framing it like when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, they awoken the sleeping giant. And almost like America's that same way, like we are a sleeping giant again. And imagine if we just started talking to each other, the explosion of potential that would come from that, because it's all sitting there. We have all this freedom. We have all these tools and resources, where we're all just so scared to come outside of our shell and say hello.
And I think that on that end, on a deeper level, not only would it help with just the knowledge that could be given to each other, it would also help for finding middle ground, which is something we see as a big issue in this nation.
Yeah, and especially as in the blue, you're in the middle. You're trying to be the neutral area, and you're trying to, in almost every case, it can probably feel like you're negotiating with terrorists, no matter where you are, no matter what the situation. There's a book that I've been reading. I can't think of the name of it. It's an FBI hostage negotiator, and it's like how to get a yes from everyone, and how to be able to talk to people in a way that gets them to say yes, even if they want to say no.
Good stuff. Speaking of books, what is your favorite modern nonfiction book?
Modern nonfiction book. Business book, I would say it's The Advantage by Patrick Lucioni, because it talks about how to create essentially a healthy organization. And he talks about one of the last advantages in business is having a healthy organization. That strategy can be copied, it can be duplicated, but the health of the organization is the one thing that other organizations can't copy, because it takes people, it takes leadership. On the other side, I would say I've really enjoyed, probably one of my very first ones was The Total Money Makeover by Dave Ramsey. He really opened my eyes up to that you don't have to treat debt as a child, almost, that it's not going to be there for the rest of your life, that you can actually get rid of it. And I would say one of my very first ones that I started reading was Zig Ziglar's Better Than Good. And that book really was my very first book almost. He was the kind of the first guy that I got hooked on. And that really opened up my mindset to this idea of when people say, how are you doing? People used to say good, fine. But they're either good nor fine. Inside they're dying, but no one's really able to say the right thing. So I kind of got tired of just having that default answer. So I adopted Zig's answer. And now every time someone asks me how I'm doing, I'm always saying better than good. And it's usually a kind of a trigger for them to wake up, because they're not expecting it. Sometimes it's a reminder for me that I'm doing better than good, even if maybe I'm not truly feeling better than good. It helps lift me up, and sometimes other people need to hear it more than I do.
That's great. Yeah, and those are all wonderful books. And yeah, in fact, I had Zig's book on CD, so I would often listen to that driving to jobs back in the day. Back when
Never Split the Difference was the name. Never Split the Difference was the name of that FBI hostage negotiator.
Okay, yeah, I'll have to look that one up. I'm actually not familiar.
You probably love it, because it's from the 90s, and he was the senior FBI hostage negotiator through a lot of different situations, and he essentially opens a playbook up of how they have to get a yes every time and how they do it.
I'll definitely look it up, and I'll definitely link it up in the show notes too, in case any of the listeners want to find it. Last of these type questions, what's the place that brings you the most peace? Your favorite spot to kind of stop and breathe and enjoy life?
There's a couple different ones. Oddly enough, airports, because I love airplanes. I'm actually a big, giant plane nerd, and airports are the best place for me to be stranded, because I get to watch planes take off all day. On the other side, I would say watching a sunset or a sunrise. One of my very first things I started doing in the health category was I read The Miracle Morning, so I started going on walks in the morning. It was the summer, so it worked nice. And I would just go on a mile walk around the subdivision, and it kind of hit me as the sun was rising, and it would just hit my skin. I almost feel like Superman, where I get my strength from that sun, because there's something reminding you when the sun rises that today's a brand new day. And I always like a Zig Ziglar quote that failure is an event, not a person. And yesterday really did end yesterday, and today's a brand new day. And that sunrise is kind of reborn, that today is the day of new possibilities, that you can really write it however you want. And that's really a very peaceful time for me, is when I'm just going for a walk and watching the sunrise.
It's wonderful. Yep. And those are, it's those little moments that are so important.
I mean, I can imagine sitting in a police car and you're on the night watch and you're parked somewhere, maybe doing paperwork, and you're seeing the sunrise from somewhere. That there's probably some similar emotion connected to that moment where you pause to just enjoy it as it rises above even if you had a bad night, that kind of sunrise is a signal to you that today's a new day, despite what happened last night.
You're absolutely right about that. And I'm in Central Florida, so cool days are few and far between. But on a cool night, when you can look up and see the stars as well, because we're in a fairly remote county, it's changing, but it was a remote county. And when you can see on a clear, cool night all the stars up there, it's kind of that same feeling of awe, no matter how crazy the evening has been. You were in the Marines for 4 years?
4 years, yep. 2003 to 2007.
So talk a little bit about that, because that became the catalyst eventually for what you're doing now. So what was your experience like in the military, and kind of that starting point for where you are now?
So we'll go to the starting point because it's a little bit interesting of a story. So when I got out, I was going through high school, I was looking at colleges, but they didn't really feel like I was going to fit in. And so I wanted computers. I was always good with computers. So I first started looking at the Air Force. I had ruled out the Navy. I didn't want to be on a boat. I ruled out the Army because it just didn't seem interesting. And I ruled out the Marine Corps because I just thought they were only infantry, and that I knew I didn't want to shoot stuff up. So I crossed them off. So I went all in on the Air Force, and the recruiter came out. We were pretty much probably 2 weeks away from joining the Air Force. And then the Marine recruiter had a bouncy house at our church picnic. And I didn't even go over to him, too afraid. But my mom goes over to him and talks to him first because she wants to make sure that I'm exploring all my options. And next thing, I go over and start talking, quickly find out the Marine Corps has everything that everybody else has. Talking to him in the guidance counselor's office on Tuesday, and then 2 weeks later, I'm raising my right hand for the Marine Corps. And I would have been voted least likely to join the Marine Corps. And it was kind of like my dare to be great moment, where I took the road less traveled and the harder one for me. That was probably the hardest choice that I've made up to that point in my life. And I'd grown up on a farm, so I knew what work was, but I wouldn't say I was really forced to make a lot of hard choices. And boot camp was extremely hard for me because I had never really put myself into a lot of adversity or just kind of mental tough type situations. And overall, the Marine Corps, I was good Marine from the smart point of view and maybe the leadership point of view, but I could never really shoot and I could never really run. And so it was one of those things that kind of like a love-hate relationship, that I hated physical training, but at the same time, I loved the idea of being a Marine. And it was actually a short time that I had as a platoon sergeant that really kind of ignited me to this idea of leadership. And one of my favorite things to do was take a Marine that others had given up on, and maybe it just kind of like continued just to rag on them or just give them stupid punishments to do because they can, and turn them into something, like really figure out what's inside but beyond who they think they are and try to pull that to the surface. And that's kind of what I lost when I transitioned, was that ability or love of leadership. And it wasn't until I first started hearing Zig Ziglar that I was like, these are things that I already know. They just kind of were beaten and suppressed by the civilian world. And then that kind of sparked my journey of just kind of understanding leadership in general. And then going even further, as I started trying to figure out a side hustle, I was trying to figure out something more impactful I could do. It really hit me when I figured out this dad idea, because I'm a dad and I've got 3 kids. I've got experience, and there's other dads that I could help lead through this darkness into a better way.
You know, those experiences and stuff that we go through, it's so important to becoming the bedrock of, and we don't realize it at the time, but it becomes kind of the bedrock of what we're going to do down the road and the missions that we can fulfill.
I mean, that church picnic is my defining moment where I chose to go left instead of right. And that completely has shaped I didn't even get computers in the Marine Corps. I got generator mechanic. And even that choice affected me, because that's what I was in the Marine Corps. That was my first job when I got out. Even my day job I have today is still connected to generators. So even all of those paths have somehow put me on this path that I'm on now. And it took me a long way to come back around. But now, as a dad, and I look back, like, it's a good example of how in the moments you really can't figure out how life is happening for you. But I've really liked to frame it as life is happening whether you want it to or not. And the choice and the question you need to ask every time it's happening is, what can I do with it? Who can I save? Who can I help? whose pain can I lessen by sharing this story of whatever I just went through? Because it happened. Once it's happened, you really can't do anything with it. So it's really about trying to take what life has happened to you and trying to do something with it and grow something from it. And I've always liked the analogy that the best flowers grow from the big pile of shit. That if you want a garden to grow, you put shit on it, and that makes the best flowers. And that's really what you want to do, no matter what you have as an experience or background, because the best flowers do grow from the big pile of shit.
It's absolutely true. You know, in some of your writings and when you talk and so forth, you talk about this idea of rather than telling veterans, thank you for your service, it's more of welcome home. Can you explain that a little bit and how that transitioned from your own experience?
So I would say when I first came home, when I transitioned out, because I was in Okinawa for 3 years, so I was literally away from home, far, far away. And when I first came home, I was actually a little bit homesick. And I really wouldn't say I did any process or really had anything that said like, okay, now I'm home. But as a veteran, and I was actually avoiding being labeled for a veteran almost 10 years. I didn't really want to, it wasn't something I acknowledged. If you figured it out, okay. And it always felt awkward when people were thanking me for my service because I didn't consider it special. And most veterans don't consider what they're doing special. And I think probably most law enforcement don't consider what they're doing special. They just consider it doing what they love. And we did it, and that's it. We're doing it. Your guys are doing it, and someone's got to do it. And it probably feels a similar awkwardness. But for me, that triggering for coming home is that a lot of veterans, when they transition out, they never stop thinking about what they had in the military. There's questions that get answered, like why I lived and he died. There's questions, what did all those 4 years mean? What did this mean? What did that mean? And we just keep getting on these loops and thanking us for our service. It just triggers an emotion of frustration of not understanding why someone's thanking us for something. When my best friend died last year, like that's not something that we get prided when someone thanks us, when we have that pain inside of our heart still. But when you trigger someone to go welcome home, you're triggering a thought or process that actually has a process that while I am home, someone just told me welcome home. And it kind of triggers a mindset shift to be more present. And that's what the goal of the podcast is, to bring every dad home mentally, because a lot of dads come home physically, but we often don't reconnect with our families. And the one thing, and probably this is a similar thing with law enforcement, is ego is the one thing that veterans forget to turn off when they transition out. And when you trigger someone to say welcome home, because we're not expecting it, it triggers like an entirely new set of processes and thoughts to kick in. And when your ego is on, your ego will create a barrier between you and your family, because you're going to project that you have it all together. But that projection puts a barrier between you and your emotions. And your family needs you to feel emotions because your kids are going to have emotions that they're going to need to feel. And you're going to need to feel them with them. But if your ego is on to saying that I have it all together, I need to be the poster board police officer that has it all together, that doesn't cry, then you're not going to be able to cry with your kids when they need you to cry. And that ego is one thing that I've kind of used it as a flashlight a little bit, that wherever my ego is strongest, that's kind of an indicator where I'm trying to hide. And if you think about because you're trying to build something up in that area that doesn't exist, or that you're afraid of someone figuring it out. And so I use ego as kind of a way to focus for my self-development, that if my ego is strong in a certain way, then that's definitely probably an area that I need to focus, because I'm trying to keep something in the shadows. And when you're trying to keep something in the shadows, you're really not living a life of integrity, because I like to break down integrity as a whole number, using integer as a term from math, that it's one unfractioned. And if you're living a fractioned life, people can tell. And it pushes people away, and it maybe even makes you come off as a person that people don't trust. But if you work through and live a whole life of integrity, then those shadows don't really exist, because everything is in the light. But if you have something in the shadows, generally your ego is there to protect it.
That's powerful. That idea of ego, as what you described, it's very similar. Have you ever read John Eldridge's Wild at Heart?
No, I've heard about it. I haven't squirreled it yet. It's getting up on my list of things I'm going to squirrel soon.
I understand. And keeping up with books and so forth with what we're doing, it's...
Especially in this space, you get so many, and the list can only go so far. Usually it takes 4 recommendations, and then someone will... I think you might have been 5th, actually, so I'm behind on that recommendation.
He talks about this concept, or this idea of the poser, that men often, because he specifically is talking about men in the book, but he talks about this idea of the poser and how we put this face forward to the world that is very much in line with your concept of ego. And it's something that we do to protect those spots, protect those areas of our life that we don't want other people to come into. And you're absolutely correct. I've seen it time and time again. In fact, it was a lot of the reason why I've started going down this road with the law enforcement community.
When we were talking about, like, when you think of something in the shadows, you think that people are going to judge you negatively. And this is the beautiful part about vulnerability that is almost completely lost in most of society. And there's a lot of in people that have to project, like law enforcement, that have to project a sign of strength, is that when you do share what's in those shadows, your brain feels like you're no longer going to be safe and you're going to feel weak. But actually, when you share something like that and bring it out into the light, it loses its power over you. But then the second thing magical happens is you give someone else in the room permission to go second. And there's kind of an idea behind vulnerability that I've copied from a friend, that the world is waiting for you to go first. And when you go first with whatever is in that shadow, you're giving someone else the power to take their step and go second. And when you do that, you actually become a beacon of strength, not of someone of weakness.
I love that. Absolutely love it. And that's so powerful for everyone listening, as well as a great reminder for us. You know, you had written a blog post in reference to Veterans Day, and you made a profound statement in it. And you talked about how serving for a veteran doesn't make us special. It's just a thing we did. Now it's behind us. And you said, but really, we never put it behind us, because we are always looking for answers to questions like why my service mattered. And often we may conclude that it didn't. Can you take us into that moment, into that thought process there, and some of the negative ways that maybe that question can be answered for people?
I'll answer for my first, and then I'll answer it another way. So for myself, I spent all my time in Okinawa. I was deployed 3 times to Korea. I went to the Philippines. But I would say it was all training exercises. But when you're over there, I mean, most of it can feel like it doesn't matter. I mean, you're there to protect the veil of the Asia Pacific area and the North Korea threats and China and all those different things. But a lot of that, you're like, did any of that 4 years have any effect? I mean, I gave 4 years to something in freedom, and people are thinking me something for I barely hold myself up for being proud of. And when you transition out, you start using that because you feel almost ashamed that, like, see, people are thanking you for something that you don't even find pride in, that you start hiding behind it. And like I didn't acknowledge that I was a veteran openly a lot. And it took me facing towards it to really figure out how it did prep me in 1,000 different ways for a life that I was just preventing myself from stepping into. And it's really, when you try to find pride in your service, it's not about trying to find pride in your service. It's about trying to take the toolbox that the military gave you and do something with it. I kind of like to think of it as like a 1,000-piece Snap-on tool set. There's a lot of freaking wrenches in that tool set that you have no idea what's going to do. But it's like working on a car, that one bolt that has a special wrench, and you're not going to know what that wrench is for until you get to that bolt and you're like, oh, that's what that wrench is for. And that's kind of like what I've framed PTSD as, is that it's a whole bunch of growth that happened in a short amount of time that normally can take 50 years, but you experience in 10 minutes sometimes. And it's about how to try to figure out how to utilize that as a tool. At some point later in life, you're going to have a moment where, like, man, if I didn't have that experience, this moment would have been a lot harder. Those are how you kind of reframe your service and let go of it, because there's another idea behind that, and that probably the biggest thing that I've taken away from the podcast is legacy. That we get hung up on the service as our legacy, that's what people are going to remember us for. But people actually don't really care about our service. It's something people do, they thank us, but most really don't really get interested. It's even as an employment, most employers don't care that we were veterans. They want to care about the results that we did. So you really just want to kind of put it behind you, but you have to switch from that legacy of your service to your legacy of your family. And that's really where we don't do it, which prevents us from coming home. That as we show up in our kids' life, that's the legacy that people are going to remember. What kind of adults did we put out into the world? Did we put out adults into the world that go to change it, to influence it, solve real world problems? Or did we go out, create kids and go out into the world that create more problems that you're actually, as a police officer, maybe trying to prevent? And you're not doing your job at home to make sure that you're creating kids that go out into the world to make it better. And there's one question, and I'm sure this happens for someone in blue that's lost someone in the line of duty, is maybe why I survived and the other person died. And this analogy works perfect with the blue as well, that they died so that you could go home and be the best fucking dad that you could imagine. And if you frame it that way, you have to then make sure that your life lives up to that sacrifice. Because if he was a dad, he doesn't get to hug his kids anymore, and his kids don't get to hug him anymore, but you do. So you always need to almost measure your life. Are you taking big enough risks? Are you living your life? Are you coming home in a way that's strong enough, that's worthy of that gift that that guy gave you that didn't come home? Because that's what it's all about. When you focus on your family and the ability of what other people have gone before you to give you that freedom, to be a dad, to have that privilege, that's really where you start to make that transition towards a legacy that'll make a dent, and really how you frame all of that pride in a way that goes out into the world to make it a better place.
That's very powerful and so accurate and true to what I've seen as well in the law enforcement community. And even in cases where it's not even a survivor's guilt kind of situation where someone's
I'm getting emotional even after just saying it all.
Well, it's powerful. It really is. And, it's not even only in those situations with survivor's guilt. Sometimes it's just being in the situation. I've been on scenes, where someone else has been injured or whatever. And it's kind of like, well, did I make the right decision? Did I do what I needed to do to protect them or whatever? And you find yourself really running.
Was there something else I could do? And it all happened, and you just need to try to figure out how to grow flowers from it. And the better you figure out how to be a gardener in your own garden, the stronger your legacy will be. Because and especially military and police officers we both experience a whole lot of life in a very unique way. We're both part of something that's probably less than 1% of the population. And we have experiences, tools, and methodologies that no other American has in their resource to be a dad. And if we can help our kids go through what they're going through and be a stronger individual, have the confidence to go out into the world to really think that they can change it, that's the best thing that you can do. If you're out there trying to protect your community, the best thing you can do to protect your community is to create great adults. And Billy Graham said this, and I'll never forget it, that he has talked to stadiums of 60,000 people. And he says that if he would have taken that same amount of time and spent it with his kids, he would have had a greater impact on this world.
Wow.
And so take that in, like the best chance you have to make a stronger community is be a better dad. And when you frame that in a way to go be a better dad, you kind of have like an obligation to do that, and then use all the things that you have every day to get it done. And there was just a blog post that I wrote this weekend we were watching the Christmas Chronicles on Netflix, which is my new favorite Christmas movie that came out last year. And in it, the son lost his dad to a fire. He was a firefighter, and it devastated his son. And the story is kind of about him kind of coming home to a family, and he was finding validation and answers in all the wrong places. But his dad gave him a knife, and on it said, "A Pierce always sees it through." And that's really the only memory they really share of dad, other than a few Christmas memories. But at the very end, that knife gives that kid purpose to save Christmas, essentially. And essentially reminded him that he has everything inside that he needs. He took that knife to remind him. Maybe you're in blue and you're going to die next week, but you don't know it. Everything you do as a kid, you're going to give them things that they're going to go out into the world to try to change it with. And if you can give them the confidence that they have everything inside themselves already, that's like the big takeaway is for me is the best Christmas present we can give our kids is the belief in themselves, because then they truly will go out in the world to try to change it, because you've given them that gift of they have everything inside they already need.
Very good. No, that's so important. Let me ask you, when you talk about this idea of moving from your legacy of service to the legacy of your family, do you have any actionable steps that maybe you've identified for someone, be it in the service or coming from the law enforcement community?
It was something that I figured out before I figured out the legacy. So legacy wasn't something I started with the podcast, but when I went in with it, I went with a simple idea and reminder to every dad that kids spell love Time. And that the best way to create a legacy is really just to give the gift of time. That your kids measure how much they love you or how much you love them based on the amount of time you spend, not based on the amount of gifts that you do. And there was a lady that came on my podcast, and she's like, your kids will love the world if you give them 10 minutes a day. Like as little as 10 minutes, you can make their behavior change just by making a deposit one-on-one. And sometimes maybe it's going on a date. Like I've asked my daughter, hey, you want to go, who's 7? Want to go out for dinner? And she's like, hey, can we go to Subway? I'm like, yeah, we can go to Subway. Or we've gone ice skating together. Like the best way to create a strong legacy, that very first step is just be there. That gift of time is one of the most magical things that you can give them. And probably another thing that happens is just be, especially as probably in the blue year, there's a lot of time away. I'm sure it's like a firefighter where there's a lot of time off and a lot of time on.
Yes.
Just be there and try to listen, because there's some transition advice that I give when dads come home from deployments, is that be curious with an open mind of what life is like when you're not there. Ask questions about what things in school are they going through. Maybe you have teenagers. Figure out what's keeping them up at night. Figure out what's truly on their heart when you're not there to hear. And because that kind of like builds like what I've started calling is like an empathy bridge, because then you have this thing to relate to each other on, and then you emotionally can connect with what she's feeling. And 9 times out of 10, you have a story in your own life that would teach her a lesson about what she's going through. So in sharing your own stories about how you had similar things, that again builds that connection of similarity, builds a connection of bond, and it builds the trust that they can come to you when they do have something serious. I've heard it said with my kids, like they're all little, so this works perfect, that if you don't listen when they have something simple when they're young, then they'll remember that you won't be listening when they have something big. So just being there to listen, no matter whether it's something like, oh, someone hit me at daycare is usually what I get to right now, or someone pushed me, or whatever it is. Maybe it's a happy moment. You have to be there to listen, because if you build that memory that you're always there to listen, then when it is something hard, maybe it's she's got a boyfriend that maybe is abusive, or maybe she's got a boyfriend that isn't communicating, or any case of anything, having that trust and is being able to listen is an easy way to just kind of ease what's on their heart. Because if their heart's light and you're helping them through it, that's where they're going to realize the confidence that they have already everything inside them.
Yeah. No, that's very good advice. You're right. Our schedule, at least for where I work, and it's different. One thing with law enforcement is it's not uniform across the nation. People, depending on where they work, be it county or city or federal, will have a completely different experience. But for us locally, we're on 12-hour shifts. And one thing that I find, obviously on the days that you work the 12-hour shifts, because it's like a 2-on, 2-off kind of schedule, you really just eat and sleep on those days. And I've talked about a few times on the podcast how, unfortunately, what ends up happening is after your 2-day, that first day off often is spent in more of a decompression state. You're just over it. You don't want to do anything else. And then the next day is often spent preparing to go back to work for the next 2 days. So even though you only work half the time, because it's 7 days on, 7 days off, essentially, you're still spending most of your time getting ready either decompressing from being at work or preparing to go back to work, which is not good, because it often leads to being checked out at home or other responsibilities, or even, trying to run a side business.
Yeah. And the hard part is going to be that life still happens when you're not there, and you're going to build up probably a lot of guilt, because sometimes you're going to hear about a story maybe your wife shares while you were gone, or maybe she calls you or texts you about a bad day and you're not able to do anything. And that's going to build up a lot of guilt. But the one way that you can work through it is just open up an ear and hear it be a shoulder for whatever she needs. I mean, I've learned like 3 days after my daughter had something in second grade happen at school, and that she was having an issue on Friday at school that she's only now telling me about on Sunday, but it immediately brought her to tears when she started talking about it. And she had bad behavior for 3 days. And so there's things on their heart that if you can get them to open up, it allows them to move past it. But if you're not there, then they're just going to kind of learn that you're the provider, but not the presider or protector part of being a dad. And you need to be there for all of it.
Yeah, so important. So a little over a year ago, I believe, if I've got my math right, you had started the Military Veteran Dad podcast. What's been the reception among the veteran community with that?
I would say it's a very mixed bag, because like people in blue, they're not always looking for a resource that can help them, because we do have an ego the size of the universe.
So much truth.
And yes. And so they're not looking for the help that they need. So when I do find a dad, there's kind of two. There's kind of the dads like me, they're maybe already find something in the self-help podcast, maybe as a dad or something else, and then find me, and they're already kind of like the nuts cracked open. But then there's a whole nother group of people that aren't even looking for the resources, that don't even know that they're out there. So I would say it's a slow and steady race, and I always try to focus on not trying to change the world, but just trying to change the world for one person and one person at a time, and try to go as deep with that person that I connect with as possible, because if I help change their life, then they'll hopefully tell someone that I kind of create a bunch of small little ripples in a pond that eventually the ripples can't help but become one larger one. But it's a part of the process that you just kind of need to keep going. And I believe in the mission, and that people that do connect with me and do resonate, I get multiple emails of, I appreciate what you're doing so much. And sometimes, like my first solo episode I was talking about, I got an email and guy was like, I feel like you just hacked my mind. Like I said exactly what he was thinking, but never really said it out loud. So it's working, but it's definitely an uphill battle. And probably the one way that I've networked with a lot of the military spouses, because they're married to the dads that didn't come home, and they're the ones looking for resources. I have like 15% of my listeners are women, trying to figure out what their husband is. One of my most loyal listeners is a friend that does the podcast, Amanda Huffman, who does Women of the Military, and she listens to my podcast when she's mowing the yard to get better insight for her husband and what's going through his head.
That's great. Yeah, and I'm finding a similar thing even with my listeners, where a lot of my listeners are actually non-law enforcement. They're the wives and husbands of law enforcement officers. So I'm finding the same thing, that often the resource isn't necessarily recognized by those of us who need it because of the nature of the work. And it just takes time for us to realize that, I need to make a change, and this is going to help me do that.
And the best part about podcasting, and I always have a mindset of going past the audio waves and electrons and try to, like I said, touch someone's life deeper, either through thank you notes or really a phone call, whatever it is. But you ultimately, the podcast kind of starts marketing itself. And I always ask people, how'd you find the podcast? And like, one person was like, oh, Military One Source recommended it. And I was like, I've never done a single thing with Military One Source, and somehow they're recommending my podcast. So like, once you start keep doing it, you just, as long as you believe in it. And the big thing about podcasting is you only fail when you quit. That as long as you move forward in a direction, and the direction can change, but as long as you keep moving, you really can't help but fail, because you'll eventually create something that keeps moving with you, and it can't help but be successfyou.
I love that statement, and that's great advice in a lot of ways. You only fail when you quit. That's wonderful. Let me ask you a question I ask a lot of people. Do you believe in a work-life balance?
I believe in seasons of life. So I believe that like right now my kids are young, 7, 5, and 3 again. And for me, my primary focus for balance is to create, I would want my podcast to turn into a business so I can be a stay-at-home dad. Because right now I want to be nothing more than a dad. So for me, it's about balancing out what's priority in the season. Like I believe that if you have a newborn, that's the season where you want to be completely present, because these are the years that everybody wants back. And when you're 50 looking back, whatever choice you're making, whatever email you're sending will never be justified when you look back at the memory you don't have anymore. And I know when my kids are older, I'm going to be in a different season of life where they don't want to hang out with me. And then I'll be doing different things. And maybe I'll be engaging more in work, because then it's not so heavy with the kids and the time has changed. And they're more interested in their own things, and they have their own friends to hang out with. So it's really, to me, about making sure that your priorities match the season that you're in. If your kids are really young, this is the season that everybody wants back, and it's better to do less work and to maybe sacrifice the promotion now, because that promotion will never be worth it when you're looking back at 50.
That's very good. Let me ask, what is your vision, or what do you think as far as the role of mental health when it comes to this idea of coming home? Because obviously that's a hot button issue right now, and a lot of talk nationwide about it.
I think mental health is a good buzzword that people use out there. But the problem with mental health is it's loaded with 2,000 different types of people. And maybe a good way to explain this is I realized when I was creating the podcast that the number that's repeated in the community for veterans is 22 veterans kill themselves every day. And I realized that like there's a lot of people out there with 22 and movements. There's lots of organizations for 22, but you can't save all 22 at once. 22 people have different problems. They're all different types of people. And the thing with mental health is you really can't take a machete and just swipe it and make the problem go away. There are multiple different types of people. That's what I like about podcasting, because I realized I'm focusing on one. Instead of going an inch deep, 22 times wide, I'm going a mile deep, one person wide, the military veteran dad. And to me, mental health is about picking a person within that space and trying to go a mile deep in those issues and just keep going and digging. And then through that, then you create a resource and a conversation about something that's not happening. Even if you think of there's a statistic for mass shooters that like 66% of mass shooters come from fatherless homes. So if you think of this podcast and the ability to create better dads, or your podcast to create stronger dads coming home to their families, that all helps create and fix mental health problems in mass shootings. But those are all different types of people that get to that point. But you can't really focus on that point. You got to go back to the roots, where the root is growing up in a fatherless home where the dad's not there to shepherd their kids into the world being strong adults. But again, for me, I focus on the one particular dad. And I think that's the best thing. If you have a niche or an itch to help with mental health, don't help everyone. Pick someone that's from your past, maybe, that has a connection to mental health. Find that person out there into the world and help as many of that type of person. But you can't fix everybody at once. And I think that's what a lot of the conversations try to do, is we try to group everybody in a big giant pile. And the pile explodes because that many people, it's like putting magnets together with north and south. They just can't help but repel each other because they all have too many different issues to be able to be helped by the same tool, which is why Congress can't legislate mental health away.
Right.
It's not something you can legislate away. It's something that comes from the roots of our society, and the roots of our society are built in the family.
You're absolutely correct. And that, I think that gets missed at so many levels, be it at a lower governmental level all the way up to, like you said, the Congress and so forth. When they try to legislate something on a mass level, it can't be done because we have to go back to those little baby steps.
And that's why I love about podcasts, because I kind of picture it as like a windshield that's cracked but not broken. Like it's just a bunch of little pieces. And podcasts are kind of like the glue that goes in between, like the resin that maybe the auto glass specialist would come by and inject into your glass to make the scratch go away. That's what podcasts they're like micro conversations in our society in small areas that are being ignored by the mainstream media. But those little micro conversations are the glue that will ultimately put all the little pieces back together to a giant clear windshield, I believe.
That's well put. And I think that you're absolutely correct that it allows us to literally change the world one small conversation at a time. And that's what I love about this forum as well.
And it's so many conversations are happening in podcasts every day, and they're conversations that are happening nowhere else. But there's people out there, thousands of them, that need that conversation. And if there's a person passionate like me and you out there giving a message, you can't help but put things together, because the magic of podcasts, and especially in our case with mental health, especially when I describe it as veterans, where there's like echo in your side your head. And if you don't talk about what the thoughts you're having, those thoughts become so loud that they drown out every voice around you. And they eventually come to one conclusion, that your family's better without you, because it's so loud. It's just cycled through all the solutions. And the only one is that your family's better if you were gone. But the moment you hear someone else say something that you are thinking, your brain loses its power to drive that conversation, because it's convinced you that you're the only one having this feeling. But the moment someone else has that thought, you instantly cancel out. It's almost like a deadening effect to the echo. It just completely goes away, because you can't have a crazy thought that someone else is having, because I'm not the only one having this. And that's what's beautiful about podcasts, is when someone shares someone vulnerable, you just canceled out someone's negative thought that they were having that maybe is a suicidal one, because their brain no longer can argue that I'm the only one having this. And all it took was someone, again, going first, and then someone else gets permission to say, you know what? I think there's a solution out there that my brain's not seeing.
Absolutely. That's great stuff. And that's so true. And sadly, I've seen the effects in the law enforcement community. Within the last year, we lost somebody, and that's kind of part of what our mission is. And I think that's so important, that getting people to understand that, we're all people, we're all human. We all have these same experiences, these same struggles, and getting that message.
We all have the same monkey brain that is 3,000 years old, running on old programming, trying to run in a modern world.
You're absolutely right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the future. You had you had written another blog post, which I love reading your blog post, by the way. You wrote it as creating a legacy of the family so strong it rivals the dent in the universe, which you had referenced Steve Jobs' quote, "We're here to put a dent in the universe." So let me just ask you, what are your plans and your mission with both your podcast and what you're doing with your business to put a dent in the universe?
So I would say if I frame this to like my kids, my goal is to give them enough experiences to give them a very wide view of the American dream. And Andy Stump from Navy SEAL gave me this, that our obligation as a dad to give our kids the widest view of the American dream, and that there's just not one path, and going to school for 12 years isn't going to figure out the widest view for them. So I want my kids to have an experience of traveling internationally, seeing other cultures, seeing how other people choose to live their life, and just seeing how other paths are taken, and that there's not just one flavor of ice cream. Because that, to me, gives them the momentum and the clarity to go out into the world and make that dent faster and sooner, because they maybe graduate from high school knowing exactly where they want to go. For me, I want to kind of just create a space where right now, like, there's nothing more I want than just to be dad. And for me, that creating a space for that emotion to thrive right now. And I would say as I grow further past this, something else, I would love for this to turn into a public speaking, and that I do talks around the country on this topic and helping others go second after I've gone first and share my story, and hopefully maybe cancel out that thought. But past that, I don't really know. But right now, I just know that I want to be a dad, and I know that I want to create a space for that to happen. And I want to make sure my kids have a very wide view. And I've often just used India as an example, that there's a lot of life benefit from seeing someone in India with nothing that has a smile on their face. Because in America, we get it wrong that you need the Apple Watch in your hand to have a smile. But in India, there's literally someone that has nothing and they have the biggest smile that you've ever seen. And that's a lesson for the heart that I think every kid needs to know before they become adult.
Yes. And if we could just get that through to so many people, you're right, that's powerful because of just the way we look at things and the way younger people look at things. And we don't realize the power of just being happy to be alive and being thankful to be alive.
Yeah. And as going to the Steve Jobs thing, I like to describe the universe as a wall. And that when someone walks by that wall, they're going to say that dent was a Killoy's. And that's what our obligation, that's the ability we have as a dad, a military dad, or a dad in blue, because of the life we've experienced. We've experienced life in a way that only 1% of the population even comes close to touching. That think of the adults that we can create if we can share the experiences and craft really memorable experiences for our kids to go out into the world and change it. And another thing that comes from Andy Stump, he says that as a Navy SEAL, he was trained to be the most effective killer on the face of the earth. But his effectiveness was only the range of how far his rifle could fire. So if the rifle had a max effective range of 500 yards, no matter how much training, 500 yards was his max effective. And if you're in blue, your max effective range could be the range of your pistol. And no matter how well you train, that's the max effective range you have as an officer. But as a dad, you can literally go decades into the future, centuries into the future with if you think of some of the names that people remember today from 200 years ago, that's the 200-year dent that they made in the universe, that people are still remembering their name. And there's another blog post, a veteran is only forgotten when people stop remembering their name. And if you create a legacy so strong that your kids can't help but create a wave, your name will always be remembered, and that's the true legacy.
Wow. You know, that is so life-changing. I hope that for the listeners and so forth listening to this, I know that I have been moved on some of these points too, because it's so powerful at what the opportunity we have. And I think sometimes we forget that. And I know for sure, as being a small business owner and trying to do these other things, we forget, like you said early on, we have all the opportunity in the world just sitting in the other room in the living room playing a video game right now, taking the kids and helping change their life and helping give them that strong foundation can literally change the world.
Yeah. And when going back to like kids spell love TME, some simple, stupid examples. Now that it's winter, like the number one thing, and even during the summer, when I would tell the kids it's not winter yet, their number one thing, if I ask them on any given weekend what they want to do, they go mall walking. And it was something stupid I came up with like 2 years ago, where we just went to the mall in town before it opened, and the old people were walking around getting their laps in. And we would start at one end and they would run to the other. We would do some games and get a pretzel and an orange Julius. And that is literally the number one thing that my kids ask to do, is to go mall walking. And it is the simplest, stupidest thing or time investment that I do. But for them, it's like a nuke of investment in love, and theoretically. But it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be something as simple as going for a walk. It can be something as simple. Even we just used to, when my kids were sleeping, my younger two, I would take my oldest to go get groceries, and we would go to the mall and have a pretzel, and we would have a conversation about what was going on at school.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't have to be complicated, but those moments can be ones where you really start to make, like, you can think legacy as something complicated, but it begins in the micro moments where you're just having a conversation with your kids. Like my oldest, we talk, and we've recently started journaling every day of something that made her, she was grateful for, something made her happy, something made her sad, and something 1% that she wants to work on better for tomorrow. And we've come a couple different versions of this. We've gone through just kind of what bedtime talk, which my younger one, we just tell jokes to each other, but that still creates a very safe space between me and her. We did something with my oldest called bird poop talk, which was inspired by a book that someday a bird will poop on you. That no matter what you do in the universe, someday, somewhere in the world, a bird just pooped on someone's shoulder despite how happy they were. And it's up to you to decide how you want to react to it. So we would call it bird poop talk. They talk about all the kids that pooped on her in the day and how she reacted and how she could do it differently. It was something simple and stupid, but getting them to talk about what they're feeling and labeling it, that is so powerful for them to be able to move forward.
Absolutely, it is. Well, Ben, as we get down towards the end here, is there anything that maybe I haven't asked about that you'd want my listeners to know and our listeners to know?
I think this final piece, I recently gave it on Veterans Day to my daughter's elementary school. Talk about a killer speech that almost felt like I was going to explode with anxiety, talking from kindergarten to third graders about Veterans Day. I didn't explode, though. That the best thing that you can do for someone in blue is friendship. And the same thing, I'm sure, for veterans, that being in blue or serving in the military is a very lonely business. And especially on the other side, friendships aren't something that we're good at. And we have a lot of storms going inside. And the best thing you can do is to be the friend and be the rainbow that comes after their storm, because you could be that something beautiful that transforms their storm and lets it pass. And that friendship is how I've moved my life forward. And it's some of the best things that I even offer today, that I don't have any products yet, but I offer friendship for free. And I'm the friend I wish I had 5 years ago for others.
That's great. And that is something that we talk about a lot, and on this podcast and in other formats, it's that importance of relationship and how that really is the basis of human life. And
going back to talking to people, you need that connection. That community is one of the big takeaways that I've taken, that you need. Maybe I'll rattle off my 4 top takeaways. My 4 top takeaways in my podcast are: your legacy of your family is what counts. You need a community and a tribe. We've done life together as men for 3,000 years in a tribe. We need to have a tribe to do it together. We were never designed to do life alone. You need to have, I can't think of the third one, but I can skip to the 4th one, that you need to be able to prioritize your wife, because that commitment with your wife is the one that you've made till the end of time, and that your kids are going to betray you. They're going to leave you, but your commitment to your wife will always be there. Your priorities always need to be your wife first and your kids second. And making sure your kids even see that example will also help them go out into the world and get married, understand how to have their own life prioritized. Because the commitment the only second commitment close is to death. That the one commitment that goes all the way to the end is the one that's on your finger. And you've committed to do life long past your kids. And you need to make sure that your priorities are aligned with that as well. It'll long live your career. Everything will transcend in a shorter time than your marriage, because your marriage is all the way to the end.
Well, I love the path that you're on, and I really think that this conversation is going to make a difference in a lot of people's lives. How can people connect with you and the great work that you're doing?
The best way to find me is themilitaryveterandad.com is the website. I'm on Facebook, Instagram. Instagram is Ben_Killoy, at Ben Military Veteran Dad on Instagram as well. I'm pretty reachable guy. My phone number is on my website. I even have a link. You can schedule time to talk to me on my commute, which is one of my favorite things to do. So if you want to have a conversation about anything I've talked with, or just need a friend, there's a link there at the top that says Let's Talk. You can schedule it even in the morning and or afternoons, and it automatically creates a calendar, and we can get going on it.
That's great stuff. Well, Ben, I really appreciate you coming on. This has been very insightful, and I know I've learned a lot, and I know the listeners are going to as well. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Wayne, for the opportunity to tell my story.
Thank you for joining us this week. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I just wanted to let you know, if this is your first time finding us, that we do have a couple different styles, formats of podcasts that we do. This is called the Interview Room. And on here, I sit down with guests from all different walks of life, law enforcement, military, etc., and just try to get some good information for you that's going to be useful for you in your everyday life. Then on every Monday at 5 o'clock, I release the Monday morning roll call, and that's about 10 minutes. It's a monologue style, monologue format, where I sit down and I just go over different topics that may be beneficial to you throughout that week. So I hope you'll check those out. If you're interested in those or anything else, definitely check out our website. It's ontheblueline.com, ontheblueline.com. On there, you're going to find links to our closed Facebook group. You're going to find links to all past episodes of these podcasts, as well as some other additional information that you may find useful. So thank you again for listening, and if you enjoyed this show, the last thing I'm going to ask is just please share it. Let somebody know about it. That way we can try to get this message out to as many people as possible, and hopefully it will be beneficial for them and that they will enjoy it as well. That's all we have for you this week. I'll see you next Monday at Roll Call, and in the meantime, I will see you out there on the Blue Line.